This is really a frightening thing when you can't have an exchange of ideas and a debate. That's how you get to scientific results. But to tell people to shut up or don't call it the China virus because that's racist and to do all these other things shuts off the thinking process. The Department of Energy, like apparently the FBI before it, concluded with some level of believability, credibility, that the virus, the pandemic, was released from the Wuhan Lab in communist China. I don't know why this was so controversial, except for the fact that, of course, Joe Biden's been on their payroll for such a long time, and our bureaucracy is defending the communist Chinese regime. They don't want to confront them over this. It cost God knows how many Americans their lives and people worldwide, and just was a terrible, terrible event. But they say, don't worry, it's not part of any kind of a military effort to come up with chemical weapons. That is such a lie. What, the communist Chinese are so moral? They're going to say, oh, we would never do that. Of course they would do it. They're sending this blimp across the United States. They're slaughtering Uyghurs. They're now rounding up Christians. Did you know that? They're doing all sorts of stuff that demonstrates that they're capable of it. I think they are. But that aside, if you watched our program on Fox on May 23rd, 2021, we introduced you to a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Wade. Nicholas Wade has been a very well-known science writer in Nature, the magazine Science, the New York Times Science page, where he was an editor for decades. And he came under an assault, a withering assault, because he wrote a piece earlier that month in May 2021 suggesting that the evidence seems to lead to the idea that this virus came out of a lab. And because Tom Cotton had said so a little bit earlier, but he didn't have the scientific evidence, just common sense. And later Donald Trump said the same thing and said he had the intelligence information, apparently he did, and he believed it. The problem was the media, the Washington, D.C. scientific fascistic community, the social media platforms, they insisted that that's not what happened. So this is really a frightening thing when you can't have an exchange of ideas and a debate. That's how you get to scientific results. But to tell people to shut up or don't call it the China virus because that's racist and to do all these other things shuts off the thinking process. So we thought it'd be a good idea just for you to remember a little bit of what this gentleman said, Nicholas Wade, because he was really the first in terms of the people in the scientific community. I believe, Mr. Producer, he was a Nobel Prize winner, wasn't he? Yeah. So this is no slouch. And again, he came under a withering attack. I feel like we were the first to apply science, this man's analysis, to the so-called lab theory. The document that he wrote was fairly extensive, and it had very good information in there. It was the first to point out that nonprofit group in New York, the fake letters that were being pushed out by the scientific community, that the CDC and others had been funding this process where you create these killer viruses. It was he who revealed all that in this document, and he gets no credit whatsoever. So we will hear. Nicholas Wade, go. Welcome back. I'm here with Nicholas Wade, who is a well-known writer about science and worked for the New York Times, Nature, Science magazines, all these expert sort of areas, and wrote a piece that has really drawn my attention, the attention of a lot of people, in something called the Bulletin of Atomic Science. So it sounds pretty important. And so I took a look at this, and I want to get into this again further. Peter Daszak, you said, he's the president of the Eco Health Alliance of New York. He got a grant from our infectious disease federal department. He used a grant to fund some of the research at the Wuhan lab. Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Wade. Daszak, there's a publication called Lancet, and what did Daszak and Lancet wind up doing in terms when the pandemic first broke out?
Well, when it first broke out, there were two very reasonable scenarios for the origin of the virus. I mean, one, it could have jumped naturally from animals, and the other, it could have escaped from the lab, which, after all, right in the middle of Wuhan is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as we've said. But right from the beginning, public perception favored natural emergence over lab escape. And that perception was very much shaped by a letter that appeared in The Lancet and derided lab escape as a conspiracy theory, and said that natural emergence, of course, was the way this virus had emerged, and we should all stand shoulder to shoulder with our Chinese colleagues on the forefront of fighting the disease. Now, this letter, it later turned out, had been drafted and organized by Dr. Daszak, who, of course, if the virus had indeed escaped from the Wuhan lab, he might certainly be perceived as being at fault for not overseeing it better. So he had a clear conflict of interest, which unfortunately was not declared to the readers of the Lancet. And indeed, his letter ends, "We declare no conflict of interest."
And this was cited by a lot of the media at the time, as I recall, and people who said, well, maybe we ought to look at the lab and so forth, as you point out. They were dismissed. Some of them were dismissed as kooks. President Trump said maybe we should look at the lab, and maybe that had an influence on the media in our country. Who is Christian Anderson?
Well, he's a virologist, and he was the author of a second letter, which also was widely influential in shaping public perceptions. And this second letter also said that the virus could clearly not have been manipulated, and therefore natural emergence was the best solution. But in fact, there was no good scientific basis for his statement. He was assuring the public of something that he could not know for sure. And that is something that, in general, scientists, in my view, should not do.
So we have these scientific journals, we have these scientists, we have sort of these groups of scientists. In the case of Daszak, he had 20, 25, actually 35 signatures. We have this second one from Anderson, 5 signatures. The media basically used these letters as an argument that it had to be from animal, jump to human beings. Why do you think the media was so incurious? I mean, people are getting ill. This is a pandemic. Wouldn't you, I mean, if you were back at the New York Times and so forth, wouldn't you say to your editor, I want to know how the hell this happened?
Well, I agree, Mark. It's very puzzling to me why the media, headed by the science journalists that are on the staff of most mainstream newspapers and networks, didn't run after this story, which by any standards was one of the biggest science stories of the decade. And I am perplexed to know why they didn't see through the rather large holes in the Anderson and Daszak letters that so much shaped public opinion. But with the science journalists sort of going along with the natural emergence theory, their editors, who I guess will depend on their advice, went along too. And in addition, the whole issue became horribly politicized, essentially by President Trump saying the virus escaped from the Wuhan lab and not providing any evidence. Now, I'm pretty sure, my guess is that what his intelligence service said to him was exactly the same as they've been saying under the Biden administration, namely that we cannot rule out the possibility of lab escape. And Mr. Trump, I fear, dropped all those caveats and announced it as if it were an outright fact. So therefore, everyone who was with President Trump sort of favored lab escape, and everyone who was against President Trump refused to consider it. It seems to me to be a reflection of how sort of politicized our whole public discussion has become, that these political attitudes prevailed over what should have been scientific curiosity.
Well, let me say 2 things about that. If I'm Mr. Xi in Communist China, and if the President of the United States says it came out of a lab, then why wouldn't I provide the data that you indicate in your article that the Chinese have, but they won't release, to prove otherwise? And I suspect President Trump may have been trying to goad the Communist Chinese into providing that data. He said it came out of the lab. All the communist Chinese had to do is say, wait a minute, here's our data, have access to our lab. Isn't it interesting that the Chinese will not, as you say in your article, release any of the data related to this research?
Yes, I think it is. One has to sort of bear in mind that the sort of knee-jerk reaction of authoritarian regimes is to suppress data, and the Chinese did suppress data after the SARS-1 epidemic, which had a perfectly natural causation. Nonetheless, I think what we see here is a very systematic and relentless cover-up, in that all the records of the Wuhan Institute have been concealed, all the databases with information about bat viruses have been closed down, and I think the trickle of information that the Chinese have let out has been mostly either false or designed to mislead and misdirect.
This man was very good, and his reputation came under attack, and if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see he's still under attack. And yet he was the one, really, the first scholar, or I would argue expert in this field, not that he's a doctor or scientist, but certainly an expert, who concluded that it was likely the lab, who's not a politician, not just giving his opinion. And it was that article that I read, again, not an easy article to read, but it was a very important article that convinced me that he's right. And that also pointed out that we had been funding these efforts, and that this nonprofit and the gentleman running the nonprofit in New York, he was behind this letter to kind of redirect the media to take attention off him because he got a grant and that group was involved in this. And the whole thing stunk to high heaven. And it still does, as a matter of fact.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.